series, Finding True North in the Midst of Change, Veteran Transition and Moral Injury. I'm Eileen Schell, a professor of writing and rhetoric at Syracuse University, and I'm coordinator and co-founder of the Moral Injury Project. It will be my honor today to introduce our guest presenter, Reverend Dr. Zachary Moon. But first, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement and thanks to our sponsors. I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And for thank yous, this event would not have been possible without the support of so many people. First, Dr. Brian Conkle, the Dean of Hendricks Chapel, and the staff members at the chapel who supported this event, Delaney Vanway, Peg Northrup, Alex Snow, and also intern Christina Cole. Many thanks to our ASL interpreter and captioner who are making this an accessible event. And a big thanks to the generous donors who made this event possible. I also want to thank the Moral Injury Project Steering Committee, Susan French of the Montessori School, and our two steering committee members who will serve as moderators today, Jennifer Reddy, Veteran Services Coordinator and Associate Director of Continuing Education at Lemoyne College, and also Jen Jeffrey, an academic librarian at SUNY Plattsburgh and a U.S. Coast Guard veteran. Today's program is part of a three-part series, and today is part 2. Today's session will focus on rebuilding the house, reparative practices, and community-based efforts addressing moral injury. Our webinar leader is Dr. Zachary Moon, Associate Professor of Theology and Psychology at the Chicago Theological Seminary. Dr. Moon is a nationally recognized voice on the topic of moral injury, lecturing and leading workshops and trainings across the United States. He's the author of Coming Home, Ministry That Matters with Veterans and Military Families, published by Chalice Press in 2015, and also Warriors Between Worlds, Moral Injury and Identities in Crisis, published by Lexington Books in 2019. Reverend Dr. Moon has been on the front lines of ministering to service members, veterans, their families, and communities. He has served as a chaplain in multiple contexts, including the United States Navy Reserve from 2011 to 2019, and the Pathway Home, a residential treatment program for combat veterans diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. He has also been a chaplain resident in the VA hospital system. After Dr. Moon's remarks, there will be time for questions and responses from the audience via the chat function. Jen Reddy and Jennifer Jeffrey will be bringing those comments and questions forward to be addressed. So don't hesitate to type your comments, questions, remarks in the chat, and during the question and answer time, we'll bring those forward. Without further ado, it's my honor to welcome Reverend Dr. Moon.
Thanks so much, Eileen. It's great to be back with you all this week. I'm thinking that some of you were able to join us last week, and some of you may be joining us for the first time. I've shared my screen, so I've got some visuals here that will accompany the presentation. I want to encourage you, as Eileen did, to raise questions really at any point in time in the presentation in the chat box, so that we have an opportunity to engage with those in some dialogue after the conclusion of the kind of initial presentation here. What I did last week, what I hoped to do last week, was to share some orienting concepts and ideas about moral injury, some of which may have been very familiar, some of which may have kind of pressed out onto some growing edges of the moral injury discourse. But certainly you would have heard from me last week really a kind of commitment around engaging both as a scholar and as a practitioner with moral injury in a way that begins to kind of broaden our perspective on what moral injury is about, how it can happen, where it happens, and also really the need to be inclusive of context, not only inclusive of the military, but also beyond military service as well. And my intention in our time together today is to kind of build upon those ideas, um, to make some claims and put some ideas forward about reparative practices and community-based efforts, and recognizing that you all here, hearing this presentation, are yourselves in some different contexts, right? Some of you are working with veterans, some of you are veterans yourselves. Some of you may have non-professional relationships with folks who are veterans, right? Folks in your families, friends, that sort of thing. So this presentation is not meant to kind of prescribe, here's how to do repair for yourself or for anybody else, but rather one of kind of, again, putting forth some ideas that I think you all, situated and located where you are, hopefully can kind of take some of these ideas and use the ones that are useful and applicable in your context. So let's just get right into it. One of the places that I want to start in this conversation is to think a little bit about what I see as being two dominant narratives concerning military service members in this generation. I would describe that first narrative as being the hero narrative. This is the one that is very much oriented around the phrase, thank you for your service, right? And the kind of quick response of thank you to your service when someone is identified as a veteran. You'll often see, particularly civilians, kind of offering a thank you for your service kind of response to that. And what I want to say about this is there are some things that are helpful, as there are in any kind of narrative, and there are also some particular kind of barriers or even deficits that get created. And again, this is true with any narrative, not just the hero narrative. But one of the things that happens with hero narratives, like in this case, is um, many of us who have served in uniform may feel a sense of pride and accomplishment and connection and honor when it comes to remembering our service. And so somebody saying thank you for your service, again, may be something that's an affirmation and something that we would appreciate hearing. However, for many of us, our military service was more than that, right? It wasn't just something that we were sort of easily proud of, but it often has layers. It has certain kind of complexity to it. And so the trouble with hero narratives is that they can sometimes kind of bulldoze over some of those layers and some of that complexity. And so the kind of heroic dimensions get celebrated and made visible in the kind of social and political conscience, but maybe the other elements, the places that feel unresolved and ambiguous, the places where we still struggle with certain things that we were a part of or we experienced, those get sort of quieted, flattened, silenced, marginalized in significant ways. So then the question kind of becomes, well, where do I talk about this stuff? If everyone is so quick to thank me for my service, in other words, where am I supposed to talk about the stuff that's more complicated than that? I sometimes problematize the thank you for your service impulse by wanting to kind of locate two things. One, the sense that I have is that thank you for your service in some ways is a kind of historical corrective. A kind of recognition that during probably most particularly within the Vietnam War generation of veterans, many of those veterans returned home to an American society who was fiercely embroiled in anti-war activism and critique around certain dimensions of that war in particular. And I think there is some historical memory about the way in which those veterans were treated upon homecoming. And so I think the thank you for your service in some ways is a kind of pendulum swing, a kind of historical corrective saying those veterans were treated this kind of way. Let's try to treat these new veterans, this new generation of veterans, by demonstrating more appreciation. And again, that's good, but we also want to recognize saying thank you for your service to a veteran now doesn't really balance out the scales in terms of how veterans were treated a generation ago. And again, the issue can be with thank you for your service that it's sort of, well, I think about it this way. Thank you is something that usually happens after something, right? It's not the first thing you say. It's not the hello. It's the it's the thank you, right? It's almost like a punctuation within a certain kind of dialogue. So if the first thing you say is thank you, that can also maybe foreclose, or at least from my perspective, foreclose further conversation, right? If you've already said thank you for your service, are you inadvertently communicating to me, I don't really want to know about your service. I just want to say thank you, and then I want to move on about my day. And again, I don't think that's the sort of conscious choice or intentional choice that's being made by folks when they say thank you for your service. Sometimes inadvertently, unintentionally, it can have a way of kind of foreclosing and also marginalizing some of the complexities of what military service is about. So we've got that as a pretty powerful narrative in American society today. We also now, particularly in this generation, have a kind of countervailing narrative as well. And that is, we've got the veterans as heroes, and then we also have veterans as head cases. So the kind of hero to head cases kind of tension between these two narratives. The head case tension is that we have gotten to such a kind of saturation point within media headlines and other kinds of awareness about our veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, struggling with homelessness, struggling with substance use, veteran suicide, right? These are all things that are now pretty commonly in the public consciousness and in the civilian consciousness, right? It's not something that veterans are aware of, but again, the kind of broader public has become aware of this to the degree that it kind of takes on this narrative shape. And again, like any narrative, some good things can come out of that narrative, right? Like increased attention to mental health services, need for the VA hospital and healthcare system, and other kinds of support. You see religious communities, nonprofit organizations, right? Lots of different folks kind of coming to the fold, saying, "Hey, look, war can be a very deeply stressful and traumatizing kind of thing, and we collectively want to kind of rally to support." And again, there's goodness in that, right? There's also this challenge, though, because that same narrative can also become very much predeterminative in terms of civilians approaching veterans. Oh, you're a veteran. Oh, you must have PTSD. You must be messed up. You must have nightmares every night, right? Those kind of projections can also come out of this head case narrative. And again, there's a way in which that narrative sees and also doesn't see certain kind of dynamics that are in place. So now, if I'm a veteran who's being perceived that way, this narrative has kind of created space for me to struggle, but hasn't necessarily created space for me to feel good about my military service, or to even have kind of mixed feelings about my military service, because the only thing that's getting authorized in that narrative is, my trauma and my moral injury and such. And you'll see, if you study particularly the kind of first wave of the moral injury discourse, particularly that which was done by philosophers and ethicists and theologians, kind of on that side of the interdisciplinary conversation, you very much saw a kind of suggestion, if not a kind of outright statement, that war itself was morally injurious, and therefore it was really kind of just a kind of waiting game for veterans to basically kind of self-identify this way, right? You must have been morally injured because war itself is morally injurious, and so us civilians are really just kind of waiting for this to kind of occur to you, right? And again, very much held within a kind of head case kind of narrative there. And of course, the challenge is that worked for some veterans. Some veterans, slapped the table and said, this moral injury idea really, really works for me. This describes the struggle that I'm having. I'm here for this, right? There were other veterans who said, well, now hang on a second. I don't know if I fit into that definition as such. And if I don't fit into that, maybe I've got some real problems with it. And this doesn't really feel like an injury. It feels like a struggle, but it's something that I'm working out. Or by calling it moral injury, are you saying that I am immoral? Right. And really kind of problematizing some of it in some real ways. So to me, one of the again sort of unintended byproducts of both of these narratives is that certain kinds of stigmas can get generated as a part of this, right? Certain sort of exacerbations of the gap between civilian understanding and veteran experience can be increased or intensified because of these narratives. So again, like any big kind of dominant narrative, there's ways in which the lights get turned on to kind of certain things, and also the lights really get turned off to certain things. And most of us, our military experience kind of falls somewhere in between these two narratives. There's some stuff that we've struggled with. There's also some stuff that maybe we miss about it, or we miss the folks that we got to work with as a part of our military service, or we know that we were involved in some good stuff as well as some maybe really horrific stuff. And so there's some real tension there. The trouble is, if we sort of reduce this experience to kind of fit into this box or fit into that box, we end up losing some of the important bits. And that can become very challenging. So then when we're thinking about, do veterans seek support? Do they seek care? Are they going to the VA? Are they not going to the VA? We should think about these narratives and the ways in which those are really connected. Both of these narratives, unfortunately, can be quite alienating, and it can kind of, as I say, generate some of the kind of stigma to say, I don't want to be told that I'm crazy, so I don't want to go to the VA. I know I'm struggling, right? I know I'm having a hard time sleeping. I know I'm drinking too much, but I've got some real reticence to be categorized that way or seen that way, right? By folks of authority, right? Like a doctor, right? Usually on a weekly basis when I was doing my chaplaincy residency in the VA system. A veteran would come in to the chaplain office, seeing the chaplain as being sort of set apart from the kind of, full total kind of medical and clinical paradigm, and said, chaplain, help me to understand this because, I think I'm going to go, I think my next stop is essentially to talk to the doc, and they're going to tell me that I have PTSD, but I don't really see myself like that. And if I am seen like that, what does it mean about this? And what does it mean about that? And kind of big questions coming up as a part of that, right? So chaplains, I think, are often in a position to really do some of that kind of bridging, some of that kind of necessary advocacy kind of work, and maybe kind of press past the places where you get sort of stuck in some of these pitfalls kind of within these narratives of folks saying, no, that narrative doesn't really see me, and that narrative doesn't really see me either. Those can be particular challenges. So let's press ahead here. This was a visual that I shared last week to kind of hopefully kind of make clear what my working definition of trauma is. So this is not the DSM manual's idea of what trauma is, or maybe even what your working definition of trauma is. But as I talk about trauma, I want you to sort of understand what I'm thinking about when I think about trauma. So trauma is that which overwhelms normal functioning, coping strategies, and meaning making. And again, I'll highlight normal is not necessarily a general or essentialized normal, right? What's normal for you is not necessarily normal for me. So what we need to be doing in any kind of responsive work that we're doing with someone is really understanding what normal is for them, and recognizing where some of those deviations, those changes, those sites of kind of overwhelm may be happening. And they may be showing up, as they often do with moral distress and moral injury, in the meaning-making sphere, right? My sense of my relationship with a higher power has been overwhelmed, and I feel isolated, cut off, that relationship with the holy is broken, and I'm exiled, right? I'm having that kind of experience. I may be kind of getting around and doing my other kind of life stuff, right? So my functioning, my coping strategies, may be more or less intact, but this meaning-making thing has been rattled. So you may see it in one or more of these kinds of places, but we want to be thinking about some of those kind of multiple sites when we think about trauma, because it's not necessarily just showing up in the same place for everybody all the time, and that change, in fact, may be quite different. So if you remember the title for this presentation around rebuilding the house, this has been an important visualization for me for a number of years working with folks, both veterans and other trauma survivors alike. It was a visualization that I first started using um, in a residential treatment program for combat veterans with post-traumatic stress. And I was the chaplain and the rest of the team were clinicians. And so I was trying to think, okay, I'm working with people, some of whom have a kind of explicit religious identity, but most of whom don't. Maybe they had a religious identity as a part of their upbringing, but they're not so connected to it now. Some of my folks don't kind of ever have that, right? So how can I be a chaplain for them, right? What does it mean to be relationship with them as they're on this journey? And so this was the visualization that I found kind of most helpful in giving some, again, kind of metaphorical, some kind of image space for people to kind of be able to attach things through this visualization that didn't necessarily need us to have a conversation about what they thought about God, but those conversations could kind of come up along the way. And so what I started talking with them about was, let's think about our moral identity as a house that we live in. Okay, so we're not the house, right? We're not our moral identity, but this moral identity is kind of a sanctuary. It's a kind of a shelter that we live in, and this is a house that has been built with us over time. Particularly the first house that we live in is largely built by our family of origin, by mentors and teachers, kind of important people, right? Meaningful relationships in our life are the folks who kind of help to build that house with us. And if this is our very first house, a lot of that may have been built kind of without us, right? It was the things our parents told us to do, or it was the things the rabbi or the imam or the priest told us to do, right? And so we sort of said, okay, well, these people are important to me, so I'll sort of adopt that as such. But what happens with traumatic experiences is that house, that moral identity, can get really rattled, right? And sometimes not just sort of rattled, but can kind of significantly fall into ruin. And that can happen with an acute traumatic event, right? A kind of a singular event, or it can happen with, again, working within the visualization of this imagery. It can happen because of deferred maintenance, in other words, right? We're not really kind of taking care of our kind of moral orientation in uh, uh, a good kind of way, and some of this stuff really starts to kind of give out underneath us. But in other words, this is a visualization of what kind of moral trauma in somebody's life can really look like. That sanctuary, that shelter that provides some safety, right, and some sense of comfort and familiarity gets busted up in a really kind of significant way. And what was helpful was then to really sit with folks and talk about what was it like to stand in the midst of what had been your house, right? Had been your moral identity, and again, could be religious or could be non-religious, certainly. And what does this feel like? And just kind of sitting with that imagery helped to really bring to the surface different experiences, right? That sometimes is very hard to verbalize, very hard to language. And so folks would talk about their fear, right? They would say, this is scary, because where is my protection? Right? This is dangerous. What happens if another storm comes along? Right? I'm in danger here. The roof over my head is no longer over my head. This is a big problem, right? Folks were able to talk about their grief, right, at the loss, right? This was my house, right? I liked this house, and now it's been taken from me. It's been lost to me, and be able to kind of express and surface their grief as a part of this. We talked last week also about the trauma of fatigue and exhaustion, and there were folks who would be able to say for themselves, when I look at this rubble, what I really just feel like is this deep tiredness. Like, what am I going to do with this? Where would I even begin? To sort through this or find another? Just what? Just so tired, right? So worn out when I look at this. And then this also can open up some important conversations about moral distress and moral injury, right? You get folks who are able to say, you know, I feel a lot of guilt. I feel shame that this happened to my house, right? I look out at the rest of the neighborhood and it looks like everybody else's house is doing just fine, and my house looks like this, right? Or some anger, right? Some disgust and some contempt at folks who told you this was the house, right? This was the house that was going to be a good house, right? Those religious leaders or those family members or those teachers, those mentors who said to you at a young age, this is the thing that's going to be important. This is what has value. This is what you should believe in. This is how you should live in the world. They told me this. They told me this was going to be a good house, and it didn't work out that way. And I feel betrayed as a part of that, right? There were plenty of folks who thought about this and they said, I feel like I don't deserve a house, right? If this would happen to my house and again, seemingly not happen to other folks' house, this must mean that I don't deserve a house and I should just essentially kind of walk away from this forever. And that happens to a lot of folks, right? That comes back to some of those meaning making questions, right? If this would happen to me, if God would allow this to happen, right, is sometimes the way that it gets language, then what this must mean is that God is punishing me, God is exiling me, and so that's my only kind of option here. So again, as I say, to this point in the visualization, it provides an opportunity for folks to kind of bring to the surface some of that language that's really authentic to them. Again, without trying to say, hey, let's talk about your relationship with God, or let's talk about your coping strategies today, or that kind of thing, but really kind of get oriented in that way. Here was the sort of second phase of this that also became really helpful, which is um, beginning to kind of give some visualization for what a rebuilt house and what a rebuilding process could be. Okay, so to be able to say to folks, you get to rebuild this house, right? That's what's next. That's what recovery of your moral orientation, your moral identity is going to be. That's going to be the process, the recovery and the reparative process. And again, quite literally, at least using this imagery, it was going to be about repair, right? And what I wanted to say to folks is, you're going to be doing this repair, and that's what's next. So really have your eyes up to kind of think about what that is about. And I want you to think about 3 questions, and I'll share those questions now. I want you to look at all this mess, and I want you to think about what's here that I need to reclaim. Okay, because there's some good material here. It didn't all fit together in a way that was resilient and strong when you needed it the most. But that wasn't necessarily this material's problem. It was just kind of how the whole thing fit together. So look through this stuff, right? Sort through some of the stuff, and I'll be there with you as you sort through some of this stuff, and reclaim some of it, right? Take some of this stuff, load it up into your wheelbarrow, because we want to build it into the next thing. But as you're sorting through this what looks like it's all a big mess, also be on the lookout for some stuff there that doesn't belong in your next house, because there is some material here that actually wasn't strong. It wasn't authentic to who you are. It didn't have the integrity that you needed, right? And so figure out what that stuff is, and also think about how to identify that and lay that aside, essentially, right? So what's the stuff that we want to reclaim? What's the stuff that we want to leave aside? And once we have a sense of that, let's have a conversation about a kind of community of rebuilding, a kind of community of recovery, because you're going to do this rebuild, but you're not going to do it all by yourself. There are people around you, or we're going to identify some of those people around you so that you can invite them over, and you can say, hey, cousin who I've always felt really close to, I know you got a ladder, bring a ladder by. And you can say, to your friends that you pick up basketball with, hey, I know y'all have some good upper body strength. I need you to come by and help me to lift this load bearing beam into place, right? And the important thing there for folks is to realize that it's not all on them. In other words, okay, this is not something that you have to do in isolation. And unfortunately, that's one of the reasons why folks stay in the ruin longer. okay? Because they're looking at this and they're saying, this is my fault or this is my problem, and it's nobody else's problem. And I'm just going to sit here in this ruin because I don't have the energy to do anything with this. And so I'm just essentially going to kind of shelter in place in the midst of this ruin. So part of that question is kind of reorienting a sense of what's next, right? What's going to come next? Now, here's the challenge, which is there are many situations where this happens to somebody's house, and what that somebody then does is find somebody, a professional care provider, whether that's a clergy member or a clinical psychologist or a really wonderful social worker or a friend, a family member, right? Kind of who there are many people, both formal and informal, who are providers of care in our life, and they might come to you and they might say, "Hey, my house just got ruined. You seem to have a really good house, or you seem to really know what a house should look like. So build my house for me so that this doesn't happen again." And this can be a real trap for us. And I work with folks who are training to be ministers, and folks who are training to be ministers, they want to be helpers, right? They want to be folks who can provide fix-its to problems, right? And this is often true with people who are really caring people, is just that they want to care and they want to help. And so this can be a kind of alluring trap to fall into. The danger, of course, is if you end up trying to build somebody's house for them, that house is not going to stand up, because it's essentially going to be a kind of reperformance of maybe some of the reason why that initial house didn't work out for them. So we need to position ourselves as care providers to not be the architects. The person who's going to live in that house needs to be the architect, but we can have a supportive, participatory role in that kind of recovery team, in that rebuilding team. But we've got to have good boundaries to be able to say, nope, excuse me, I'm not going to be able to do all of this. You need to be in that kind of visionary seat, right? You need to say, this is the good stuff. This is how I want it to be, and then we need to be in that kind of supportive role. So as I say, this is a visualization that I've had an opportunity to offer usefully to some different folks, and have found it to be pretty generative in terms of folks kind of being able to work with this. And I'll share just one salient point. One of the times I shared this with a group of military chaplains, and one of the military chaplains came up to me after the presentation and said, "You know, as you were talking about the house, I saw myself in the visualization, but where I realized is that because I was the chaplain, because I thought of myself as being the one who needed to kind of have it all together all the time, what happened to my house is I kept working on the outside of the house, and inside the house was really falling apart all around me. And then eventually the whole thing crumbled. But I was so committed to not letting anybody know that I was having my issues, right? Just kept painting, kept planting some flowers around so folks would think, oh, chaplain's house is in good shape, because for him, he had identified as that's what it means to be professional. That's what it means to have it all squared away in this kind of point. And that conversation ended up being just very powerful, again, to kind of recognize, look, this isn't always something that's going to come at us all at once. It sometimes can be something that kind of deteriorates over time. And so some of what we want to do is not just think about rebuild, but also thinking about good maintenance, right? Good stewardship, good care of our house. We don't have to wait for a big storm to hit us. Sometimes it's good to do some renovation work to our house, in other words. So I want to go ahead and press on a little bit. And what I'm going to remind us of is where we started the conversation last week in terms of thinking about moral distress and moral injury as being often kind of situated in these moral emotions. And we talked about guilt and shame as being those moral emotions that have a kind of inward evaluation, right? I did something, I messed up, or I feel messed up in the case of shame. It can also have an outward a moral judgment or evaluation, like we talked about Jonathan Shay's work just briefly last week, but a kind of disgust and contempt based on betrayal of others who were in positions of authority and power. I also want to locate embarrassment and humiliation, which is a moral emotion that's kind of a mixture of the two things in terms of kind of how it impacts. And if we're feeling that a little bit, we might be feeling some moral distress. If we're feeling it more intensely, we may be getting into some territory, some space that really feels very much like moral injury. We're going to be kind of stuck in it in some kind of significant way. And so we located this, but I hope you heard me say, and believe me last week, and it's worth saying again, that these moral emotions, while they often express themselves in life-limiting ways, and sometimes even self-harming and other harming kinds of expressions, they themselves have a pro-social function, right? All of these emotions are trying to get our attention to say something has been breached in the moral code, okay, in the covenant of our kind of moral orienting system. You heard me introduce that a little bit last week, right? In the way that the house is built, right? There's a problem here. Now, what we do when those kind of alert signals are going out, again, sometimes can be all kinds of problematic the way that it expresses, but at its very nature, these moral emotions are not bad, right? These are not bad moral emotions versus good moral emotions. These are moral emotions that are meant to get our attention when something has been breached or broken in that space, right? So to that extent, they're calling us to reparation. Now, this is important, okay? Because if we see these as bad, if we are quick to pathologize rage and shame and guilt that has this moral component to it, we run the risk of missing the signal, right? And getting to the place of saying, how can we alleviate this guilt? How can we alleviate this anger? Let's manage that anger. Or let's say, no, you're not responsible for that. So stop feeling responsible for that, and then your guilt and shame will be alleviated, and then we can kind of move on. And I think I shared this last week, and again, it's something that's worth repeating. In all of this, moral emotion stuff is some evaluation of responsibility. Okay. Again, in guilt and shame, I feel responsible. When it comes to disgust and contempt, you out there, right? Some other is the one who's responsible for this. That evaluation of responsibility is really crucial in terms of mapping this. Now, what is sometimes our impulse is to figure out, oh, how do we alleviate the responsibility and say, well, let's tell that story differently. Let's make a different meaning out of this so that you don't feel responsible, and therefore you don't feel guilt and shame, and therefore you don't have this moral anguish that's making it hard to sleep and making it hard to kind of go about your life in this particular kind of way. What I would like to get us oriented around is thinking, rather than alleviating responsibility so that we alleviate moral suffering, let's work constructively with responsibility. Let's think about how these moral dimensions are actually trying to get us, kind of give us the energy ultimately to do some necessary reparative, reconnective, reconciling kinds of work in our life. And that's really where we're going to turn to in the presentation now. So again, you may see some life-limiting expressions that come out of these moral emotions, but that what you do with them ultimately is the thing that really is either life-limiting or life-giving. So I want to name for us as a part of this that there are some other moral emotions. And again, I'm going to immediately interrupt myself to say these aren't good moral emotions. These are just also moral emotions. And these moral emotions may be easier to kind of take us to a life-giving place. But when we think about our therapeutic modalities, when we think about even just having a good conversation with somebody that we care about, when we think about good counseling or pastoral counseling or chaplaincy kinds of work, right? Even if we think about good education, right? I mean, just continue to kind of broaden this out. These moral emotions that we're about to talk about will often be kind of front and center in terms of what makes it a really kind of connective and empowering kind of experience. Practices, therapeutic modalities that center goodness, that get us connected to goodness, can be a very powerful counterbalance when we're feeling stuck in anger and guilt and shame, embarrassment, humiliation, when we're feeling the kind of weight of this. One of the things that we feel cut off from is a sense of inner goodness or outer goodness, right? We are suspicious, we are critical of others, right? We don't see others as good, we see others as enemy, or we don't see ourselves as good, we see ourselves as enemy in some pretty significant ways. And goodness is this kind of trajectory about purpose, right? Kind of, again, we're thinking about meaning here as such, right? And the ways in which that then becomes connected. And so we might also feel cut off from purpose, but ultimately the kinds of engagement, the kinds of practices and therapeutic modalities that begin to really get us thinking about this. Education can be a huge one around this, right? What's your vocation, right? What's this meaningful work that you have to be about? Let's talk about compassion. This is a big one within ministry context, but I think is also shows up in a number of therapeutic modalities. The way in which we are together, right? When we show respect and dignity and care for one another is very significant, right? In terms of kind of expressing compassion and our ability also to show compassion for ourselves, right? Forgiveness is something that is talked about pretty frequently within moral injury discourse. I want to have a conversation with you about forgiveness, but where I would really like to talk is about compassion and the way in which practices of compassion and responses of compassion can have really powerful effect, and the way in which compassion then kind of grows from that place into some significant ways, connecting us with a sense of service and broader connection. Here's one more I want to talk about: trust. And again, when we're dealing with moral distress and moral injury, trust is sometimes something that feels like it's been breached or we're not connected. Again, it could be I don't feel like I trust myself anymore, right? I messed up in such a big way, or I feel messed up in such a big way. I don't trust myself in this situation or in that situation. And so probably what I need to do is alienate myself. I need to isolate myself and be all by myself because in fact I'm not trustworthy. Or these other people are enemies, these other folks can't be trusted, and so my mistrust and my awareness, my sensitivity to who they are and how they are, right, has put me in this kind of odd. So what are those, how are our practices engaging with folks in a way that help to get us reconnected with trust and feel like we're connected in those ways? Because ultimately that's a journey around community, right? If I don't trust myself, I'm not going to trust myself in community. If I don't trust you, I'm not going to find myself in community with you, right? And those are significant really pieces to this, which is often why moral distress and moral injury often drive folks into isolation, which again can become ostensibly the sort of sitting by yourself in the ruin, in a significant kind of way. So just like we talked about kind of how this then kind of builds out to be able to think about reconnection and reparation kind of moving out in that kind of way. So there's a lot here, and I'm happy to engage this as a part of our dialogue portion as well. But I want to talk about three instances, sort of three examples of practices or therapeutic modalities that I think brilliantly key into what I've tried to kind of lay out here, and maybe give us an opportunity to kind of prime our pump a little bit in terms of thinking about where you're working and the kinds of necessary work that you're doing, either personally or professionally, or again, with folks that you care about and are attentive to in your community. Where we need to move here is in terms of thinking about meaningful relationships, because that's the kind of connective tissue, right? That's the sinew that really ties this stuff meaningfully together. And so the three examples that I'm going to offer really kind of connect us there in a significant way. So here's the first. So some of you may be aware of organizations like the Mission Continues or Team Rubicon and what they're doing through their work. And I'm not necessarily here to promote any of these organizations. I'm not a lobbyist for any of these organizations as such, but what I want to point out is some of the very powerful ways that these examples, again, kind of key into some of the moral emotion work and what kind of reparative community-based work can kind of look like. So let's think about disaster relief. Let's think about community service, right? And we begin to see how some of these kind of powerful, reconciling, and reparative emotional energies that are in us in the midst of this kind of moral quandary, this kind of moral anguish, what can begin to happen here? Well, look, it's really hard to feel bad about yourself when you're building a house for somebody who needs a house, or you're doing disaster relief. There is such a kind of immediate and obvious, a kind of unambiguous goodness about that, right? It's like, this needs to be done and I'm here doing it, right? And the kind of immediacy and kind of undeniability of that really, again, not reinforces, but can really rebirth a sense of connection with goodness and purpose. And mind you, this isn't a talk-based therapeutic modality, right? We're not asking these veterans to sit in our office and talk about their issues. These organizations are providing opportunities for folks to go about and do the work. And in doing the work, it has some of these reparative and reconciling kind of dimensions to them. Trust and community are also huge in an example like this, right? There is a way in which, again, the kind of service to and being a part of community are very significant. These are veterans who may have served with one another, but now are serving together in a very significant way, right? Shoulder to shoulder. Again, not in a space of, hey, I've got to talk about my deepest, darkest pains and anguishes, but rather, let's just do something really good together. So in this way, I find this to be a very powerful example. And again, organizations like this are not just saying, hey, if you have PTSD, come do this, or hey, if you have moral injury. The doors are open in a way that I think is really valuable. What they're just saying is, come work with us. And in the process of getting to work as a part of this team, doing disaster relief, doing community service, these benefits then are coming to the surface in some pretty significant ways. Here's another one. So I don't know how many pet lovers we have out there. I don't know if some of you are involved doing pet-based therapy or dog training or some of this kind of stuff. But the saltiest, just kind of stuck in his own misery combat vet that I worked with when I was at the Pathway Home, didn't want to, just resisted all of the talk-based therapy that was offered to him, just wasn't interested in it, right? Just wanted to kind of shut down all that kind of stuff. And then a puppy showed up in his life, and it was going to be his responsibility to care for and train that puppy for a noble purpose, right? To be a service animal. Again, think about the immediate and undeniable connection with the moral emotions that we've talked about here, right? Right? Purpose and service, right, are just immediately happening there. Now, again, I don't want to presume that you're dog people, but I observed in his relationship with that puppy that so much of what he was stuck in was almost instantaneously, at least temporarily, melted away when that puppy crawled up into his lap and just licked him all over his face. There was something unconditional and undeniable about the kind of goodness of that connection. Again, no matter how fleeting, no matter how temporary, that powerfully oriented him back to a place of saying, there may be goodness inside of me because this little creature, right, is affirming and recognizing and connecting with that goodness in me. And I don't feel good about myself. I feel angry all the time, but this little puppy isn't licking my face like that. This little puppy is licking my face like I'm good, right? Maybe tasting good, right? In some kind of significant kind of way. So I think one of the things that is often so powerful about this, again, relates very, very directly back to the question of what's happening with our moral distress and moral injury in these kinds of cases. Again, a number of these projects and programs are not necessarily saying we're just looking for folks who have moral injury, but for those of us who have experienced it, this is something that I think can be quite powerful in as much as it gets us connected in some significant ways to these life-giving moral emotions that ultimately are of themselves, being able to connect and feel that, experience it in a bodied kind of way, right? Here's this dog, right? Not talking to me, right? Not giving me feedback about my drinking problem, but is just present with me and loving of me in a way that begins to kind of help my body and my cognitive physiology as such to feel that sense of goodness and feel that sense of purpose again. And maybe that's the very thing that I felt cut off from. I want to offer one more, one that I was a part of, and some of you may have been a part of as well. And that was in the midst of a long community, um, uh, a long-standing, growing community presence at Standing Rock. A number of veterans, really a huge number of veterans, ended up participating in that. Some of them were a part of it for longer, and a whole bunch of folks came at one time. And that was the time that I came. And I came because there was some recognition within the community that was about to receive all of these veterans, that in fact, these veterans might be bringing some stuff with them that may be very wonderful and also could be potentially dangerous kind of within this context. And so asked, are there some chaplains who would be able to be a part of this? Not just religious leaders, but folks who could kind of be oriented around chaplaincy and have a sense of veterans experience maybe well enough. And so I was a part of a group who got to go and be there kind of with that purpose in mind. And what I realized when I was there, again, kind of with specific attention around the veterans who were there, is that a lot of them were showing up with this deep desire to connect with community, to connect with a sense of purpose, right? To feel as though there was some reconnection and that even in being in that space and participating in activism, something was being repaired. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't simple. The layers of that were pretty complicated. And the more I talk to folks, the more I appreciate how complicated it was. Because for some veterans, there was a feeling of um, a kind of blood redemption that was necessary in that space. They felt like they were there to bleed on the front lines of a confrontation with the paramilitary force that was there, again, very much surveilling and very much kind of policing and had prior to our time there had been very violent at times to the case. And so there were veterans who were saying, I'm here to bleed, right? That reparation for me looks like a kind of redemptive suffering in this space. That's a deeply complicated kind of way to think about activism. But I will say to you, as honestly as I can, it is something that compels many folks to activism, a sense of I need to be on the front lines, because if I can be on the front lines, the sense of purposefulness, right? The sense of honor is exemplified, and I need to do it again because I value justice, or I value community, or I need to repair something. So again, I don't want any of us to sort of think too idealistically about the need for reparation. The need for reparation can sometimes be complicated and elusive, right? There is moral injury for folks that can't be easily reconciled, cannot be easily repaired. However, there are ways in which that reparative kind of experience can be realized, even if it is not the sort of direct one-to-one mathematics of I harmed this person and now I've had a chance to reconcile with this person. Many times we're not in a situation like that. And for a number of the veterans who were there at Standing Rock, there was this sort of sense of, I still feel some moral struggle about my military service, other things that I've been involved in my life. But there's something about this that is about justice, it's about goodness, it's about purpose. And I feel that in a very thick kind of way. And so my participation here is going to be just that. It's going to be a kind of participation of reparation, and that's going to be significant. And one of the things that indicated how complicated that was for the veterans there was they didn't get that violent confrontation. They didn't bleed, so to speak. And there were many veterans then, or those veterans who kind of were particularly committed around that, gave voice to the idea of, well, it hasn't happened, but it needs to happen. And so I'm going to have to go initiate it. And so there was some real tension in that moment within the community of, are these veterans essentially going to kind of act of their own accord out of this deep longing for that redemptive suffering, really at the expense of the longer term and work that was happening there. Those tensions were also very real in that space. So a complicated example, but I at least wanted to note there are so many organizations, Veterans for Peace and others, that have been present at Standing Rock and other places. And if you yourself are one of those veterans, or you know some of those veterans, I hope you'll be able to hear some of the resonances with what I've shared, that activism itself is a reparative kind of activity. And so participating in those kinds of activist spaces for some veterans and for others who have felt, as I say, some moral distress in military service or in others, that begin to kind of get folks connected or reconnected where they may feel like they've been disconnected or alienated or isolated, cut off from some of those dimensions. Okay. So I want to end the presentation here so that we still have some good time to be able to open up some dialogue. I can see a number of you have already shared in the chat, and I look forward to being able to respond to some of those questions now.
All right, thank you, Dr. Moon. And I know that there are already questions in the chat that our moderators, Jen Jeffrey and Jen Reddy, will be bringing forward. So why don't the moderators go ahead with that? We have some comments, we have some questions, we have a couple of challenges to some of the things that were said as well. So we'll bring all of those forward. Thank you, Zachary.
So we can start with what strategies do you recommend for the complex moral injury that lies beyond perpetration and is at its core existential? I'm damned if I do kill, damned if I don't.
Well, I guess I would just immediately say I don't think there are any simple answers. I think when we're talking about morally injurious experiences, I think we're talking about recovery journey that again is going to take some time and some space. And I want us to be able to journey with people in ways that are particular to who they are. I would certainly concur that there are a number of folks who feel, I would really say a lot of moral injury is existential, right? That it has to do with a particular understanding, not only of self, but also of other, and also of the divine, of a higher power in a significant kind of way. And again, for different folks in their experience, they're sorting through some of the meaning making functions of that in some different ways. I don't think it has to be done by religious elders or leaders, so to speak, but I do think being able to have some perspective, have a kind of spiritually integrated or kind of morally integrated approach is pretty important in those cases, right? To be able to allow folks to talk about that. I know there's sometimes a tension between the kind of clinical medical and the God stuff. I know that as a chaplain, sometimes you'd get a referral of, oh, this person's talking about God a lot, so they must need to talk to the chaplain. And I actually think our best work often happens in interdisciplinary teams where we're able to actually kind of bring our resources and our tools to work and being able to provide the kind of wraparound care for people that is, as I say, really no quick fixes to any of that and no sort of essential or generalized answers to offer to that, but rather how do we do the kind of co-creative work and the kind of interdisciplinary care work that really sets people up in a strong position.
And then there's a follow-up to that. Does moral injury always have to occur in the context of trauma?
Oh, sorry, Jennifer, say that again. I got distracted by a good comment in the chat box. Ask me again.
Does moral injury always have to occur in the context of trauma?
Well, that's interesting. I would say yes, in that it functions as trauma. I don't think, from my perspective, I don't think we need to sort of um, oversaturate moral injury as trauma, like in any kind of reductionary way. But if we go back to the kind of working definition of trauma that I offered early in the presentation of saying trauma is that which overwhelms. When we're talking about moral injury, we're talking about an overwhelming, right? We're not, again, if we're talking about some moral distress, again, if we think about it as a spectrum, I think we can feel moral distress and maybe not sort of think about that as being overwhelming, but it raises some questions. We're having some guilt. Hey, I just had an argument with somebody that I care about, and now I feel like I got to sort that out, right? There's got to be some reparative action that takes place. I think there are a lot of small examples like that, even in a daily basis in our life. I think it's helpful actually to think about that as a continuum so that we recognize, we actually have some of the resourcefulness. We have some of the capability to understand, what do we do when we feel guilty? What do we do when we feel angry? Our military training doesn't really prepare us to do this kind of reparative work. And there's a certain kind of socialized limitation that comes with that, because many folks who serve in the military serve at a really developmentally very crucial time in your identity formation, right? Your late teens and your early 20s, your mind is not done growing and developing. And so if you're asking questions like, who am I? What's my purpose? What does service mean? Who do I care about? How do I work out conflict? The military has very particular answers to those things that have some limitations to them. I guess I won't go any further than that. And so when we're thinking about making reentry and kind of what's next for us after our military time, that can also become a particular kind of challenge, right? We may not have the interpersonal skills, the conflict resolution skills, right? To be able to know what to do when we feel really angry or when we feel ashamed. And that can become, again, another kind of isolating kind of function for us, make it hard to do that reparative work because, in fact, we don't feel like we have the language or we have the capability to do that. So that's some good support for us often. And I appreciate the way in which different therapeutic modalities, different kinds of programs are often trying to kind of help give us some of that training so that we can be more resourceful, because in fact, a lot of the work is kind of like that.
So, and there was a comment, a distinction between veterans who experienced combat warriors and non-combat veterans is important to understanding the impact of military service and war.
Yes, I would certainly co-sign on that. And I think it is certainly one of the challenges. I am I'm a little reticent, because sometimes the way that comment carries us is into a place of kind of further divide, where we say, only another veteran could understand this, and so I can only talk to a veteran about this. There's some ways in which that's very true, and there's also some ways in which that can be very limiting. And I'm cognizant of the truth, kind of both of those parts of things. That I think it's important for veterans to have some space where we can talk with one another. And not be bombarded with some of the kind of projections that sometimes come from civilians. I think it's also important that we are given opportunities and engage opportunities to connect outside of that particular niche. And I understand some of the reasons and some of the bad experiences veterans have trying to talk to civilians, and civilians, again, working from a place of misunderstanding or misestimation of kind of what's going on there, can be quite harmful and can make one really pull back and say, wow, I don't, if this is what talking to a civilian is like, I don't want to do that. And I want to kind of cut off this as such. But what that sometimes does is then civilians say that to themselves. They say, oh, well, I'm a civilian. I don't understand your experience. So let me, essentially just, I don't have to be in this, right? And I think that's where the real trouble lies, because moral injury is not just individual trauma. Moral injury has a social and collective significance to it that can't be individualized. And if it's individualized, we're actually, I would say, exacerbating the experience of it within persons, and we're also diminishing the real voice, the real powerful moral conscience that is speaking through that kind of trauma, that is saying, hey, pay attention to this, something's not right. And it's not just on individual terms, it really is in some cases on broad societal, political, economic kind of terms as well. It's important for us collectively to be able to have the ears to hear that in that situation.
So there was a follow-up comment from the same person on that, saying, my comment was meant as an observation about those of us who would argue that all war is morally injurious and all who experience it are morally injured to some extent, many seriously.
Yes, again, I would co-sign that. I would be interested in a conversation about war as morally injurious, not in actual kind of disagreement with that statement, but rather what is the ramifications of that statement? Because if the ramifications of that statement is, therefore, all military veterans need to self-identify with the working definition of moral injury, that's where I have a little bit of reticence. That's where I have some questions, because what I worry about there is then this sort of implication of, if you don't feel guilty about what you did, then you are without conscience. Then you are a sociopath. Then you are not paying attention. You're not doing your work. These kinds of pejoratives actually further isolate and cut folks off. And I'm not interested in that trajectory. So I want us to be careful with that kind of statement and where that leads us ultimately. Again, not because I disagree with the premise, but that I have some deep-seated concern and commitment around where that trajectory or that rationale takes us to.
And then there was a note of appreciation for your visualization, and just asking, would you allow us to use it when talking about moral injury?
I would, of course. I am not one of those Ph.D. folks who think that I am sort of uniquely smart or brilliant and therefore need to be in control of every thought and idea I have. Most of the stuff that I have is stuff that has come through work and come through conversation, and I don't feel any proprietary kind of ownership of it as such, because I think it is the stuff that belongs to community, and my best work is work in community too. So if you find it to be helpful, I would encourage you to use it.
Okay, now there's a question. Would you ever use the word atonement and spiritual meaning when referencing reparation, or is it too charged a word?
It's definitely charged. I think there's no disagreement there. I think when you start talking about kind of heavy religious terminology, and I'll also put forgiveness in that same category, right? These are heavy laden ideas and images in our cultural consciousness. And even if you're not a religious person, atonement still can have a kind of heaviness to it. And we talked about some of the redemptive suffering stuff last week as well. To me, the challenge for us is really working with folks in the language that is meaningful to them, right? So I would not be somebody who would say to somebody, let's talk about atonement. But if they were saying to me, hey, chaplain, or in my seminary classroom, hey, I want to talk about atonement in relationship to moral injury. I've had many of those conversations, but to me, we don't want to be predeterminative about language, particularly realizing how heavy laden it is. And my first question would be, okay, we can talk about atonement. Tell me why that word, right? Why that imagery, why that tradition is meaningful to you. How is it serviceable? What work does it do for you? Right. And then I can begin to kind of understand, because maybe I wouldn't use atonement language, but maybe I can in fact understand better, having asked that question, why atonement language and why that tradition, that imagery and some of the elements of that then become important for that person. And that's pretty crucial in terms of really having a good kind of care and supportive kind of response, I think.
And so there is a comment, expressions like stuck in his own misery is unhelpful and should be avoided as it implies choice.
That's interesting. I actually don't hear that comment necessarily as choice. If it is used pejoratively, like, there's something wrong with that guy for being stuck in his own misery, then I'm with you. So I think context is really important. And I really appreciate what I hear behind that concern or the comment there, which is there is so much stigmatizing and re-stigmatizing, so much creation of barriers and then reinforcement of barriers that often are along the lines of, this is an individual problem, and if you're having it, it's your individual responsibility to fix it, right? So that's not what I mean when I say being stuck in your misery. But if it were used in the context of essentially leveling that kind of pejorative, blaming someone essentially for this suffering, yes, I would certainly have kind of concern for that. That wasn't what I was meaning to imply in that statement. And in fact, I myself would also be worried about insinuations, again, either explicit or implicit, that would seem to say, you're at fault for your suffering. There is so much that does that, both explicitly, implicitly in our culture, and it's important that we interrogate it both in our own language and when we find it in other places. And I'll just sort of again reinforce what I hope is my commitment, that I think one of the ways that we can actually do that constructively is by not just sending all of these problems to the VA. Right? I think that there's something that the VA can contribute. I've seen the VA contribute some really important stuff. I don't think all of it can be resolved within a VA context. I think religious communities, I think education communities, I think other organizations, I think friendships, I think spaces that haven't even yet been convened are all a part of a better future, not just for veterans, but actually for all of us. And we talked a little bit about kind of broadening the definition around who suffers with moral injury. We need those kinds of truth-telling spaces. When I hear about folks doing writing workshops or other kinds of kind of group-based stuff where people actually feel like there's enough requisite trust within that space to be able to do some risk taking, to be able to share, perhaps dangerously, of their truth, those spaces are unfortunately few and far between, and I think they're very necessary. Again, in not trying to happen in a healthcare context or in the context of the VA in terms of those programs, but actually to be able to be held in some other spaces, I think is really crucially important.
So a comment. It seems for both PTSD and moral injury, we move from totally naive, the world is safe and I'm able to cope, to trauma, the world is dangerous and I cannot cope, to healing, the world is both safe and dangerous and I can identify the difference and can live with the polarity.
Yeah, Bill, I'm seeing your comment there. I like how you've languaged that. I would feel comfortable laying that language into the house metaphor, right? That first house you live in probably resembles some of that naivete, right? Some of that, I guess I'll always have a house, right? The house is sort of self-evident, right? In as much, and then trauma can be that kind of overwhelming of that, and then a sort of feeling of fear, grief, right? All many kind of emotions occurring within that trauma that ultimately in the rebuilding process, part of what you want to be able to embody as a part of that process, I think is some of what you have described as healing, right? In terms of recognizing, there is some agency here in terms of, again, how this house is going to be built, and in that being able, hopefully, to be able to recognize and relate to some of the ambiguities and tensions that exist in the moral universe and such.
So, and there's an interesting comment here that I think sort of relates, can relate to a lot of things, but definitely relates back to the combat versus non-combat veterans, perhaps. And that is, betrayal does not necessarily suggest a trauma event.
I would be interested in talking about that more. Betrayal is not the focus of my work on moral injury. It has certainly been quite the focus of folks like Jonathan Shay and others have really kind of centered betrayal as significant. I guess from my perspective in thinking about moral distress as a continuum of which moral injury is the most radical or severe form, I could imagine betrayal kind of in different places along that spectrum that again may not be experienced as trauma, but in fact may reverberate through our sense of our moral identity and our sense of kind of shared moral covenant as such. I think could be significant there.
So I know that we're coming up towards the end here, but so another comment, the essential skill as a helper is to listen and witness, staying a step behind or with the other and not to push our own meaning, which, I think you've definitely sort of addressed that. And another question is, what other populations might you see moral injury in?
Yeah, and Nancy, we talked about this a good deal last week because I think it really is a crucially important topic. And while I think it is absolutely necessary that we talk about moral injury in the context of military service and war making in particular for some of the reasons that we've already noted, I would recognize that there's moral distress and moral injury in many other contexts that also are very deserving of our attention, right? So not a sort of let's leave the military context, but let's think about some other context as well, include some other folks and some other experiences in this as well. A few of those that I would name that may not necessarily be named as moral injury as such. One of the most common sort of code words that sometimes kind of provides some coverage for moral distress or moral injury is the term burnout. I think if you look at professional burnout in some context, I think you will often find moral distress and moral injury as the kind of underlying kind of subtextual to burnout is something that was morally stressful in that space. So a few of those that I would track are nurses and other folks working in a healthcare context. Thinking about school teachers, particularly public school teachers in public school settings where they are not actually empowered to teach students appropriately, but perhaps kind of asymmetrically focused on standardized tests, that itself could be quite morally distressing. I would say, and I hope this certainly may be already attentive to some other folks, but I work with people who are training to be religious leaders. And I think it's important for us to talk about how much burnout happens within religious leadership. I think some of the reason why that happens, I could map out as moral distress and moral injury in terms of the expectations that religious communities have for leaders, some of those that run significant deficits and have moral dimensions to those. So those would be just to note a few. I think there's really important work that is happening or beginning to happen, and certainly more that needs to happen with these additional contexts.
So we've got one more sort of question that I think could be a pretty good discussion, but I want to most importantly first bring forth someone who said, as a survivor of both violent sexual assault and intimate partner violence, Dr. Moon's presentations have helped me to better understand my own moral injury, articulate my feelings, and heal more than any psychologist I have ever seen. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I know, Eileen, I don't know, or
Yeah.
Dr. Moon, I don't know if you
I think we're at the end of our time. I want to acknowledge that Dr. Camilo Bica is here, who has been so pivotal for so many of us with moral injury work. And I want to thank him for his work and constant speaking out. I taught one of his editorials in my writing class last fall to great effect. So I'm so happy you're here, Dr. Bica, and just know that your work is honored here. Thank you. I want to thank Zach, and all of the work that he's done will be available via the videos that we have taken of these two events. So if you'd like to share it with coworkers, colleagues, he's approved that. We do want to continue the conversation. We have another webinar that will follow this one next week. It will be at 11 a.m. because the two people are researchers from the UK. They're going to be in a different time zone. The topic will be moral injury and drone warfare. And the two researchers that will be working with us are from the Drone Ethics Project, which is looking at moral injury in the context of drone warfare, a very important topic. And especially for those of you working with drone operators, working with military personnel who are interacting with drone warfare, and also just the larger ethical, political, social, moral questions around drone usage, which is now not only obviously a warfare issue, but a larger issue across the culture. So I hope you will join us at 11 a.m. for that. We'll send out a reminder to people who've registered to attend that if you can. We will also be recording it. But again, I want to thank Dr. Moon for his ideas, his sharing, his generous sharing, and also his just strong commitment to veteran communities. And I want to say too, as we conclude this, the responsibility for this work is also on civilians like myself, who runs a veterans writing group in the Moral Injury Project, and that collective responsibility. I heard that very much in your last example, Zachary, around thinking about activism and communities coming together around particular crucial events. And so I wanted to say that in addition to your third example is maybe a fourth example of civilians stepping up in relationship to this, whether it's to stop warfare and stop the trail of warfare throughout generations, but also to think about what we're doing in our communities to make spaces for veterans and others who are dealing with moral injury. I mean, questions around racial justice, questions around sexual assault and trauma, questions around economic exclusion. So I just want to say your framework gives us a lot of ways to think about interventions in those spaces as well. So thank you. And thank you to all who attended. Feel free to leave a comment in the chat if you want to say anything about what this meant to you. We will be saving the chat and thinking about it in relationship to future programming and events. And again, thank you to Dr. Moon.